Hi, welcome to Forbes Let's Talk, the insurance edition. My name's Nicola Dawn and I'm one of the insurance partners at Forbes, and each podcast I'll be taking you on a journey with one of our guests through their work, life and career. On this month's podcast I've got Kella Bowers, who is head of our social care team and also our graduate training principal. So, good morning, Kella. Nice to see you.
Morning.
Morning. Should we start it off nice and easy? Tell us a bit about you and your life at Forbes and how you came to work at Forbes.
Well, I'm a returner. I started at Forbes as a trainee in the early 2000s and qualified here and qualified into the insurance department. Mm-hmm. And then I went over to the Leeds office, worked there for a while, and then I left and went to the big city lights of Manchester and went to work in the city for about 9 years, and then came back. Came back to work with my the partner I was working with when I left, because he had a raft of new work around historic child abuse, social care, and wanted somebody to come in and do that, which I hadn't touched before but seemed really interesting. So I came back in 2013 and I've been happily back here ever since.
Good stuff, good stuff. And we got to know each other well last summer during, because you became the training principal for the firm and I became one of the graduate recruitment partners along with John Pickervan. So we got to know each other well and have lots of chats about that. And one of the things that came up quite a lot is that both of our areas of law are not, as we would describe it, perhaps one you would naturally, when you're at school or uni, gravitate towards in the terms of child abuse and disease work, in particular the asbestos stuff and the mesothelioma, can be quite hard going, particularly when you're on the claimant side, but also on the defendant side.
Yes.
There's a lot of documentation to read. It's quite heartbreaking at times. How do you deal with that as having a family and...
Well, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. When you decide to be a lawyer, at whatever age that strikes you, your first inclination is not that really you're going to be doing insurance law or defendant insurer or disease or historic child abuse. There is obviously on the opposite side of that, from the claimant's perspective, there is a campaigning element to it and assisting the survivors. Which is very laudable. From the defence side, we're looking at providing reasonable damages to people where there's a legal trigger point to provide them. And in those circumstances, getting the survivors the best settlement that we can in the quickest time possible. So in terms of balancing the viewpoint around it, I feel similarly that we are doing a positive job in terms of the survivors in applying the law as it currently stands, and it's been all over the place in the last decade, but also spending public money effectively so that the public money that remains in the public sector is spent on children who are at risk now, as much as providing a response to the survivors that have legitimate claims and arguments. In terms of balancing that with family, it's interesting because I think I probably would have struggled doing family law itself. So dealing with children who are at risk now in dysfunctional family situations, or there's an abusive situation, and taking that home with me, I think I would have struggled more. The fact that what I do is completely historic, its effects are obviously still live for the survivors today, but it's a historic issue that I can't change. So in that sense, I think in a family, if I was working in family, I just want to take everybody out.
Same here.
Whereas with what I do now with historic abuse, it's more of an intellectual pursuit. It's around how the law applies to the current situation, what the social workers did at that time and what the social work practice was. So it's an intellectual and academic exercise of fitting the facts of their issues into the laws it stood at the time and how the case laws developed. It is difficult still, because when I started doing this work, two of our biggest jobs that we were doing with the Rochdale CSE and the Rotherham CSE groups, which came along with huge reports, lots of information. In the Times newspaper was leading it at the time. Every time I got in the car, it was on the news. There was the Home Affairs Select Committee happening, and that obviously then led on to the independent inquiry, which is just reported. And that was difficult, and there was a lot of books that came out. And reading people's personal and very emotive explanations of what happened to them was really difficult. And it does take some time to sort of get your head around, to compartmentalise what you're reading at work, what's happening in the press, and having that at home, because my children were quite young when I started doing this work. I've found that easier as I've gone on. And a lot of the social care papers that we read, they're not emotive language, it's very professional language, and you're following somebody's story. It's more difficult when you read the book that the person has written about their personal experiences. That's when it becomes quite difficult.
I find that quite difficult if we're doing witness statements, particularly in people who care for relatives who develop something like mesothelioma and then they can't care for their relative, and there's a lot of case law around those points at the minute. It's quite difficult, but you have to keep in mind actually what we're doing is we're providing checks and balances. So as much as I do like to roll out when people ask what I do, and I sort of say, joke and say, I'm the anti-Erin Brockovich for people of a certain age. And if you're not of a certain age, go and Google her, because she's very impressive. But I think that's the way I always try and kind of settle it with myself, that it can be really upsetting, but actually there's a job to perform, because you can't hand out unlimited pots of money, because we work, obviously at Forbes we work for local authorities, but we do work for insurance companies and corporates as well, and it's balancing lots of things, because you've obviously got the balance with a lot of local authorities. With my work, if we've got a small corporate who then might only have a limited amount of money and a mesothelioma case is going to close their business. We've got to be alive to, we're also dealing with people on the people side too, as well as providing those checks and balances. So
I agree with that, and also from a public sector perspective, they get a lot of criticism when these things happen. Some of it quite rightly, some of it in a way the public just want to centre around somebody to blame when a scandal hits. Having interviewed lots of these social workers within local authorities, I've never met one that doesn't care. They may have made the wrong decisions at times, or they may have just made the decision based on the information that they had at that minute. But the very few, I've not met any of them that don't actually care. But the impact of that criticism on a large local authority when they're the centre of the storm is really difficult. And also they've got children and families they need to care for now as well. So being part of that support network was actually very affirming for us, that we could help them to navigate what was an unprecedented situation of public scrutiny and still keep the lights on and the wheels turning. So I enjoyed that part of it, even though it was because of a very difficult situation that they found themselves in.
Because you must find yourself very busy all the time, especially running a team and training people, and looking after a team of people who are dealing with these difficult issues and stuff. And how do we look after them while they're doing that sort of work?
It's very interesting. We actually, a couple of years in, got ourselves a counsellor who we scheduled to come every year, and is always available, a 20 team member who wants to talk at any point during the year.
Brilliant.
But the other thing that we realised fairly quickly is what affects one person in the team makes them upset or they find difficult to deal with. It's completely different to what upsets another part of the team. So by way of example, one of my paralegals, her mum had been suffering quite badly with deep vein thrombosis. And randomly in one of the files that we were looking at, the child in this file, her mother had died because of a deep vein thrombosis. Now, that had nothing to do with the functioning family, the any abuse or neglect, but her personal experience meant that she found that very difficult. So we had a policy immediately. If there's anything, and it doesn't matter what it is, within the file that you don't feel comfortable with, that's it, you stop and we pass it to another member of the team.
Yeah.
And you don't have to justify yourself. You don't have to have what I may as a person found a legitimate reason to be upset about something, because we all have our own backgrounds and feelings and experiences. So that was our rule.
Yeah.
As soon as something becomes uncomfortable, you say, we hand it over.
That works well because everybody, as you say, got a different lived experience, and actually it's important in our work to keep very objective. And from the defendant side, that is what you're doing, isn't it? You're examining the evidence and you're being objective and then looking at the best course of action. But you did mention there's quite a lot of case law hanging around at the moment, isn't there? I know you're waiting for judgments on a couple of cases to come out.
Yeah, there are, and it's been like that for the last decade. We've been up and down with case law. It seemed to be fairly settled, and then we had CN and Poole that came out that the defendant market said one thing, the claimant market said another. There were then some cases that went through that supported that judgment, and then there were a couple of strikeout applications made on the basis of that judgment. And it's those that have gone on to the Supreme Court. So there's HXA and YXA, which were combined two hearings that went to the Supreme Court, and they are primarily, or they will affect primarily, the failure to remove cases. So cases where somebody has been involved with social care, but not actually had a care order, not actually formally been taken into care, but social care involved with them from a child protection or a child in need point of view. And they have not been taken into care, but they are saying, I should have been taken into care. And the question there is whether the social workers have assumed a responsibility for the child in that pre-care period.
Right.
And if they have, and it can be proven that they have, then if that has then been breached, then there's a liability. So that's what the Supreme Court are going to be looking at in HXA. YXA is slightly more nuanced in that the child in that case was put on what's called a Section 20. So they're put into accommodation by the local authority with consent of the parents, but there's no formal care order and it's not been approved by the family court. But we have control to an extent of the child because she's in our accommodation.
But the parental responsibility would remain with the parents.
Yes.
Right, okay.
So that's the more complex situation, and the question there is what happens when you put a child back from a Section 20 back into the family home. Are you creating a danger by putting them back into what may turn out to be a dysfunctional or neglectful home, or are you returning that child to the status quo that they were in beforehand, so therefore you haven't created the danger? So it's quite a nuanced question. But the outcome of that case will have quite a fundamental effect on failure to remove cases.
It will do, but it must be quite subjective though, because obviously social work sectors are massively overstretched at the minute with staff shortages and things like that. So would creating a judgment on that stretch them even more if they were... Do you think it will lead to more checks and balances needing to be in place? Yeah,
I mean, it's an interesting question. There has been an argument between both sides as the court cases have been going through the courts anyway about, from a subjective point of view, what is an assumption of responsibility? Is it the point when a social worker immediately gets involved with their family? Or is it a point when they decide the child is a child in need? Or is it the point when they put a child on the child protection register? Or is it any in between? And there's not really clarity on the point. So we're hoping these judgments will help in that regard, but we could end up with more arguments around what an assumption of responsibility.
That's what often happens, doesn't it, with judgments? That it actually creates more questions and develops more case law and more cases. And there's been the recent vicarious liability judgment as well, hasn't there? That was quite interesting.
That is an interesting one, and it helps to clarify. We always like pretty well-defined judgments because you don't get them a lot. The only slight problem with BXB is that it's two adults in a separate situation. It's not a child and a person in a position of power. So it's helpful, but it's not all square on child abuse cases. But the more judgments we get, the better it is. But it has flip-flopped recently between what the defence think is a defined assumption of responsibility and what the claimant solicitors feel that there is, and then vicarious liability is continually being stretched to cover more and more and more situations. And it is really difficult, and there are still questions over the relationship akin to employment, because there's all sorts of strange relationships. Though there was the recent footballing cases where it was a scout, but the scout wasn't specifically related to the club, and they hadn't asked him to go off and do any of these things. So there was a big case around that as to how much responsibility they had for that person. And there's those kind of voluntary arrangements right across the children's sector. So, you know, scouting and sports and volunteering and all that kind of thing. There's all sorts of volunteer arrangements that may or may not be akin to employment, and they're very difficult. It's not a straightforward defined answer to it. You've got to apply the test and see how you fare.
Which must make your work really document heavy, actually, and then going away and doing lots of research and talking to lots of people. And what's your favourite part of the job in terms of, I know it's a difficult subject matter, but what do you enjoy out of your day-to-day? What's your forte?
What's my forte? Goodness me. What we do is we get a large amount of documentation. Some of our cases can 20, 30 lever arches. So we get all of that documentation, and we create a chronology of the most salient issues. So we boil it right down. I really enjoy analysing that then and applying the law and seeing where the breaches might be, where the risks might be, and applying the factual situation to the case law.
Yeah.
Once that's done, my favourite bit about the job is the negotiation with the other side, about finding a pragmatic, where we have a case where there's going to be a settlement, there needs to be a settlement, finding a pragmatic way through it. And the reason I say that is a lot of the claimants that we deal with, they have capacity issues still into later life. Some of them have serious mental health issues, some have autism or serious psychological problems. Some of them are in prison, some of them are in adult care centres. So you may apply all the law and answer all your questions and then go, settlement needs to happen. But how do you actually provide that settlement to somebody who's vulnerable? And there are situations where a person may be particularly vulnerable, but they've got capacity, but you know that providing them with a large sum of money, they may be financially at risk from other people, from stealing that money from them. Or, you know, once somebody's got capacity, you can't change the fact that they may spend the money what we may think as unwisely. But what safeguards can you put in to try and ensure that the money that they're given provides them with the best outcome? Rather than just saying, here's a cheque. So that is really rewarding, about finding a way through, about what's best for the survivor, how best that money might provide them with a future. So we've done things like buying a car and paying for driving lessons, investing in property, arranging sort of ISAs, they're called. ISAs, so that there's an interest payment and a restriction on how much can be withdrawn. All with the consent of the person or the claimant solicitors, and in some cases the official solicitor. So sometimes you have to think a little bit more outside the box, rather than just going, right, there's a settlement, here's some money, close the file.
And I suppose as well, getting to that settlement, you might have to go and instruct a whole raft of experts, because there's all sorts of issues going on, and looking at things like financial reports and how, and as you say, how best to help somebody in that situation. We
had this phrase has stuck with me for ages. We had one case where the young man was quite damaged, and we had this exact situation. What do we do? How do we pay this money over? What best do we do? And my colleague actually instructed a number of experts to create a therapeutic milieu.
Oh, I could do with one of those.
That's a word for the day. But it was a whole package of therapeutic support, inputted from various practitioners that knew him and were saying what he needed. And so we priced it all out, and that was part of the settlement. So that's really rewarding. When you can see
and
that.
it's really interesting how you do it and how that time is spent on it as well.
Yeah.
And I presume collaborating with the client as well quite closely in terms, which is the same as what I do really, that we have to work quite closely with the clients and keep them involved at regular stages with it.
Yeah.
But with all of that, how do you relax at home after you've had a day documenting your bundles?
Yeah. Well, completely differently, I go out to the stables and ride my horse, which I'd always wanted a horse. When I was young, I rode, and then I went to A levels, and it sort of petered off as it does when you discover going out and uni. And then my daughter got into it, and I thought, yes.
Yeah.
So about 2 years ago, we bought Frank. And he's great. He's
and you're on to competitions and everything now with Frank.
Started doing competition. I was so nervous. It's taken me 2 years to actually get on. My daughter's done them, but actually doing one myself was a big milestone. I'd always wanted to do it. And 2 weekends ago, I did one, and it was great.
There you go. You've been doing them all the time now. It sounds fun. But I know we spend a lot of time during the summer with the graduate recruitment process, and not just in the summer. It's, as we've discovered, it's a year round job. But it's both of our, we've agreed wholeheartedly a number of times, haven't we? It's one of the favourite parts of the job, and really like a privilege and a pleasure to do it. But I suppose we would probably, if people are looking at LinkedIn and they're applying for training contracts, they're probably going to listen to this podcast, I would hope so. And maybe bring up your horse riding at some point during the during the thing.
Been listening.
We'll know if anyone mentions Frank the horse or Dolly the sausage dog, who's my little dog, we'll know the sausage dog who appears regularly. So although we don't love her so much at the minute because with builders in, she's just constantly barking. So she's not here
she's
today.
Protecting her home.
She is. So if people mention that, we'll know they've been listening. But we quite often get asked, both of us, sort of what our advice is and what we're looking for from people.
Yeah.
And we often say at Forbes, we want people to be themselves and to tell us what you're interested in.
Yeah. And
to really show us what you're all about, which I think is what we agree on most of the time, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. And I think, our mottos are that we are real people. And we want the people who come and join us to be fully rounded people with their own interests, their own experiences, their own route to qualification, because everybody's slightly different. And we've had people who've had some challenges along the way when they're doing their A-levels through health issues or injury. And they have shown us their resilience, which has made them impressive. Other people are very academically bright and at the top of their levels. But they have other interests that give them a rounded experience of people and how to deal with people. So we're open to all types of people coming to be interviewed and applying to the firm. And we keep being real people by employing real people who want to get involved, we've got the Forbes Foundation and we do a lot of charity stuff within the business, wanting to get involved with that, wanting to be involved with their fellow trainees, wanting to get involved with networking. But everybody's different. Some people love networking, some people love the intellectual, they just want to get their head stuck in a book or a lot of papers. But there's room within Forbes for all of those types of people, because each department does a slightly different type of work, deals with their clients slightly differently. The corporate side of the business will deal with people differently than the consumer side of the business. And we need people who want to do all of those things, who want to, people who want to work in crime and be fast-paced and, doing bail applications and just thinking that's the best thing ever and really exciting. And some people might think that's their worst nightmare. Whereas we've got corporate and commercial, where there's, you're living in the corporate world and you have to do the networking, but you've got an intellectual challenge around drafting and the intricacies of the detail. So because we're a wide practice, we're a broad church.
We are,
of
and I think the thing I've been massively impressed with, because we kind of got this role probably about a year ago. Actually, I think it was around this time. Last summer was our first round, and I've come from firms before where the experience is quite different in that it's all managed by a graduate recruitment team, whereas actually we do have a graduate recruitment team element, but we're also heavily involved because we've got a small pocket of partners that deal with it. We're also very involved in the process as well.
Yeah.
And what I've been really impressed with is the experience you get, in that you get to try a little bit of everything. So if we, as you always tell everyone, if you come to us and say you want to do corporate first, we might put you in crime first, because you've got to try and sit. And there's a lot of transferable skills between each department as well. So I think that's what I've been impressed with. And you get kind of a very... And there's a lot of work goes into people's seats.
Yes, a lot.
A lot of work goes into people's seats behind the scenes, and what they're getting, and their input and our input, and what's the best experience overall.
Yeah. And I think some people, when we say things like, we're going to put you in crime, when they say they just want to do governance and procurement, they think we're being a bit cruel. But, and I know you didn't train with Forbes, and you've come from elsewhere with those experiences. But John Pickavance and I, with the other partners, did train at Forbes. And my first seat was in crime. When I started, I thought, I want to do crime, that's all I want to do. And I loved the sort of the camaraderie and the excitement and the busyness of it. But that immediate need to make decisions on your feet and that very intense running about wasn't for me. But I found that out because I'd tried it. But the transferable skills from that were being able to absorb information very quickly, being able to know how to deal with a situation where you needed to have an answer, or when you don't have an answer, being able to say, I don't know that, but I'll get back to you, and then doing it quickly and turning it round. And being on your feet in front of, the custody officer at the suite or in the magistrate's court. It's a bit of a baptism of fire, but it gives you real strength when you move on. John says similarly, when he works in commercial, but he had a seat in personal injury. Dealing with individuals, dealing with the consumer directly was a brilliant skill to gain, because you have to know how to turn what is a complicated concept into normal language that people can understand. And
understand the needs of a customer as well, isn't it?
So every department will bring with it for you skills that you can move on to other areas. Sometimes we have to explain to people what those skills are, because they don't necessarily see them off the bat. But once it's explained, this department will give you this skill. And then when you go there, you'll be able to utilise it. People see the logic of the moves. Sometimes they go, but you're putting me where? Because they just want to do employment and nothing else. We do get that, but I think people do understand it, because we get quite personally involved with people, aren't you, and what's best for them, which is a good thing, I think. But people quite often ask us about the process as well, and we say, right, well, the applications are currently open, they will shut just at the beginning of June, I think. We will then, which you find via our website, we then ask you to do a short video on a question of our choosing. We won't be nice and tell them what last year's question was in case they prep. So we asked you to do a 90-second video. What would be your top tip, Kella, if you're doing a video for the application process? What was your pet peeve last year? Answer the question.
Yes. We sat in a room, so to give you some insight on how we do it, we sit in a room in one of the Blackburn offices for a day, and we watch the videos pretty much consistently, and we have a grid where we do fair scoring, so everything's fair across the board. But that came out as your pet peeve pretty early on in the day.
It did. It did. There was a couple of times I was like, I'm not sure what question that was answering. But it's just like when you're doing an exam, you'll get the marks for answering the question. We've set the question because we want to see you pick up on some things that we know should be in the answer, but also we want to see you develop the idea and give us your opinions. So just blurting out a set of facts isn't great. We want to see your analysis of the point and some interesting, thought-provoking
And maybe an argument of for and against things as well.
And also, it enables us to see your presentation skills. But presentation skills of being impressive don't need to be, very gregarious and all over the place.
Yeah.
Measured presentation skills can also come across really well. But this is about you being you.
Thanks so much, Kella, for coming on and being our first guest on the podcast. It's been really great to talk to you.
Great. Thank you very much for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
Good stuff. And if you've enjoyed what you've heard so far today, then Kella and I will be presenting another podcast in the future as we're putting on a legacy event covering both disease and social care in the autumn. So stay tuned for that.